Hello. Whenever we play a video game, we do inputs in real time. As we all know, however, a typical game will run at a set frame rate, often 60 frames per second, so that it breaks time into mini intervals generally of equal length, barring lag, and checks inputs at the ends of them. The consequence of this is that it's conceivable and generally quite likely for one stream of inputs to have different in-game outcomes depending on when the stream is started with respect to the game's frames. I'm not the first person in the Smash community to point this sort of occurrence out. Fizzy talked about this briefly in the context of television input lag. When discussing how it's possible for a player to be consistently technical with this in mind, he offered two explanations: that the player understands the margin of error in a stream of inputs and spaces out inputs accordingly so that the necessary timing is always met, and that the brain naturally synchronizes to the refresh rate of the television he or she is looking at and listening to. If anybody is aware of any data that could shed any light on the validity of the second claim, I would be very interested in reading it, as my brief and probably incompetent searches didn't yield anything interesting. Anyways, an explanation that I would offer in the case of Melee specifically is that most actions you'd want to do in-game are fairly lenient. For example, if you want to forward smash with the joystick in A, and you consistently press A under a 20th of a second after doing the relevant joystick input, and you held both inputs at least a 60th of a second, there is no way the game will read anything other than a forward smash, regardless of where you initiate the inputs with respect to the game's frames. In the case of situations where absolute frame precision is necessary, I expect that players can use precise visual and audio cues to at least try to place their inputs in a specific place with respect to the game's frames. What I want to emphasize is that sort of thing may often be necessary to have consistent success with some tactics. It's easy to think of a game with a high frame rate as a continuous experience, and to do inputs without regards for when precisely the frames occur, but I will use a couple examples to illustrate how doing this can carry some amount of uncertainty. Let's say I'm Marth. I want to dash to the left and pivot forward smash to the right. This can be done by hitting left, somewhat quickly transitioning to a sufficient distance to the right, and pushing the C-stick to the right a sufficient distance the very next frame. So that would look something like this. Then one frame and go to the right, past 192 as a horizontal value will work. Do that one frame, then hit the C-stick to the right after that. So hitting the C-stick a frame too early or too late does nothing. Let's call the difference in time between the right C-stick input and the right joystick input t, where t is measured in 60ths of a second. For any value of t aside from precisely 1, which isn't something feasible to expect for reasons I am not entirely qualified to go into, there is at least a possibility of failure. For example, if t is less than 1, it's possible for the first input to be done right after a frame, and the next input to be done right before the next frame, in which case both inputs are read on the same frame, which does nothing. If t is a little bigger than 1, it's possible for the first input to occur right before a frame, and the next input to occur right after the next frame, in which case the inputs occur 2 frames apart, which also does nothing. Assuming a random time of the first input relative to the game's frames, it is easy to show that the probability of a successful pivot forward smash is given by this formula, namely, it'll be the maximum of 0 and 1 minus the absolute value of t minus 1. Unsurprisingly, the closer t is to 1, the more likely you are to succeed, but note that slight deviations can cause a substantial drop in the chance of success. For example, if you want to pivot forward smash and you do the C-stick and joystick inputs 1/45th of a second apart, which is only 1/180th of a second off of the ideal difference, and if you're not being mindful of when the game's frames occur, you'd still only have a 2/3 chance of doing a successful pivot forward smash. After initially looking into this example, the topic of doing an empty pivot to forward smash instead of a genuine pivot forward smash came up. The relevant precise details of an empty pivot are that you dash one way, quickly hit the joystick the opposite direction past a certain threshold, and then move it a bit outside of that threshold on the next frame. So for example, I could dash to the left a few frames, then move the joystick's horizontal position to a value of 192, or something bigger than 192, let's say 197, for one frame, and then on the very next frame, dip it to anything below 192. I'll just randomly say 137. So if you do that, then you'll just pivot into a standing animation. There are many variables you could sensibly assign to model this, but the only one we really need is the time spent past the aforementioned threshold. Let's call that t, again measured in 60ths of a second. Again assuming a random time for the first input relative to the frames, we amusingly end up with the same formula we had in the prior case, namely, the probability of a successful empty pivot is given by the maximum of 0 and 1 minus the absolute value of t minus 1. The big observation I would take away from all of this is that if you're not too attentive to when the game's frames occur, there's a chance you will mess up in certain precise scenarios, regardless of how well you can execute a string of inputs. If you're able to align your inputs nicely with these very brief time intervals, then these issues potentially vanish.